My name is David Randall, Director of Research for the National Association of Scholars. We're discussing in this webinar the origins and effects of the Second Great Awakening, the religious revival that swept the nation in the early 19th century. Now, our speakers are, we're quite proud to have them, Robert Caldwell, Professor of Church History for the School of Theology at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, Thomas Kidd, Distinguished Professor of History and the James Vardaman Endowed Professor of History at Baylor University, and John Wigger, Professor of History at the University of Missouri. They all have very distinguished publication records, which I am not going to tell you now because they will be put into the chat button below. Everybody can take a look to see all their books, ideally with links, ideally to be purchased en masse from Amazon or what have you. So you know where to do, you know how to use your credit cards. Now, the function structure is going to be each of these speakers in alphabetical order will speak individually for 12 to 14 minutes. We will then have a sort of a moderated discussion and Q&A. What this means is I'll feel free to ask some questions myself, but in a perfect world, you, the audience, will be asking questions either by the chat button or the Q&A button at the bottom. Frankly, since chat is already being used, if everybody sort of congregates on chat, that would be easiest, I think, but either will do. The panelists can look to that themselves, but I will also be reading them, not in chronological order, just in whatever order I like, because it seems interesting for a conversation, and passing them on. Any questions that don't get answered in the course of the 90 minutes, don't worry. Send your questions to me at randall@nas.org. I'd be delighted to pass on your queries to the panelists so they can answer them later at their leisure. And again, you will have a chance to see this again in perpetuity at the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. That should be up within 24 hours, and available for anybody to watch for any length of time. And I'm going to, at this point, to go directly. Professor Caldwell, may I ask if you to open us up?
Yes, thank you, David. And thank you to the National Association of Scholars for hosting this event on the Second Great Awakening. Sometimes it's a forgotten event, but I think it's very important in the first early decades of the history of the United States. Generally, the second, and I'm going to use my comments here to kind of give a frame and outwork, an overview of some of the events here to kind of get our bearings, and then hand it over to Drs. Kidd and Wigger to go into further detail. But the Second Great Awakening is this period in early American history where there was an unusual receptivity, a positive receptivity to the preaching of the Christian gospel by thousands of ministers who fanned out across America looking to save souls. The time period we're talking about is roughly 1790 into the middle of the 19th century, 1840, 1850. There's debate on when it ends. But it was a period where there were lots of conversions. People were converting to Christianity. There were many revivals. New churches were founded. Even new denominations appeared. It was indeed an awakening. And I wanted to, just step back for just maybe a minute or so and just give a little overview of this kind of unique vocabulary that is associated with the Second Great Awakening, awakenings in general, and associated with evangelical Christianity. I mean, you have conversions, right? Becoming a Christian. Every Christian branch has some version of a theology and of conversion. When someone becomes, they're not a Christian, and for whatever reason, they decide to embrace the gospel message. A revival is when there is a spike in the number of conversions in a church, in a community, in a neighborhood, where there are lots of people come into faith. They are converted in a short period of time. And sometimes it's an event that is completely unexpected. where did this come from? Other times there's some planning involved. The church or the region might invite an evangelistic minister into the arena or the area, and a revival happens. And when you get a bunch of revivals taking place across a large region, you have what we could call as an awakening, right? Where you have lots of revivals. And when you read the newspapers, letters, journals of ministers, individuals in churches here in the early decades of the history of the United States, you see a remarkable high frequency of revivals taking place from, literally in most quarters. It wasn't everywhere at all times, but it was an event these revivals were frequent enough that that folks knew about them. They understood that this was something going on. So where are its origins? We call this period the Second Great Awakening. It has its origins in the First Great Awakening. Associated about a half century earlier, beginning with the great preaching ministry of an English Anglican itinerant minister named George Whitfield. His spectacular preaching tours of New England and many of the colonies basically created a new persona for ministers. I mean, he preached with such fervor and effectiveness that it led others to emulate him. And he also bequeathed to many churchgoers and many Christians who are already folks who are already Christians already. He bequeathed to them this kind of spirituality, this kind of spiritual intensity, that being a Protestant was just not merely holding to a certain set of doctrines, but kind of embracing this kind of these affections, these loves, these desires of the spiritual life, desires for God, desires for Christ, desires to see his message known. And thus, in the middle decades of the 18th century, you have this kind of revivalized Protestantism becoming a thing amongst many churches, many denominations, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, in colonial America. The Second Great Awakening is just basically this kind of continuation of this in this setting after the beginnings of after the Founding Fathers, after the Revolutionary War, after the Constitutional Convention and all that. And you just have this continuation of this preaching of the gospel, this revivalized Protestantism going on. I often, when I teach the Second Great Awakening, I will often talk about it in three areas, just to kind of break it down, because it is a complex event. It's very hard to, there's no one figure that kind of encapsulates the whole of the Second Great Awakening. Unlike the First Great Awakening, where you could make a good case that Whitfield is a central figure there. But in the Second Great Awakening, the first arena I look at is in New England, the New England revivals. These revivals took place in churches throughout New England under the oversight of local ministers, and this is important. These revivals were generally very theologically driven. They were drawn to the insights of Jonathan Edwards, who was a First Great Awakening theologian. And these revivals sought to inculcate a deep sense of religious emotion and awe, while at the same time trying to avoid religious eccentricities, like people kind of being overcome with religious emotion and fainting, having dreams of God, specifically communicating with them. These things, these New Englanders, they tried to avoid these kind of eccentric type of religious experiences. One of the most kind of celebrated leaders in this phase of the Second Great Awakening in New England was Timothy Dwight, who was a pastor in Connecticut for a time and later became president of Yale College, where he led the student body there in several different waves of revival that spread across campus. of Yale College, where people were, a large number of conversions. Now we contrast these New England revivals with the second arena, the revivals on the Western frontier, roughly taking place around the same time, beginning in the mid 1790s and extending well into the 19th century. These great Western revivals, as they called it, took place in these new states that were opening up: Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio. And the people that were kind of moving to these regions, beginning to populate these regions, were folks who were very pragmatic. They sought to make a new life for themselves, away from the confines, the establishment in the East Coast. Sometimes these folks were not well educated, others were not well established, some were somewhat unruly, but not completely so. But this was a difficult bunch to reach, and so the ministers and revivalists developed a set of methods to reach these folks, this unique group of folks, and their methods left a deep mark on later evangelicalism. You have the preaching in these Western revivals was incredibly powerful, convicting, and emotional. They turned up the pathos to 11. They turned it up way to great extremes. But they also sought to avoid theological subtleties in their preaching. They preached down-to-earth, practical sermons that were meant to be felt, meant to be embraced, meant to be lived. They gave them specific details on, how to repent, how to trust Christ, what to do to be a Christian. And these ministers also they carried out their ministries in this setting known as camp meetings. There weren't many churches. The camp meetings were these large outdoor venues where you have individuals, hundreds, sometimes thousands of individuals coming from miles away, hours away, sometimes days away. They would camp out, and they would get to know, the individuals would get to know other people in their region. It was kind of a fair-like atmosphere at many of these camp meetings. But they came mainly to see the region's ministers preach. And these were intra-denominational affairs. Sometimes you'd have a Baptist preaching, and then a Methodist preaching, and a Presbyterian. And these meetings, these camp meetings, became the precursors to many of the evangelistic crusades that we see today in more recent times. In the 1810s, there were roughly, some historians have seen 400 to 500 of these camp meetings a year in the West, in the Upper South, the South. They weren't as numerous in the North, but there were some. And interestingly, at these events, they kind of capitalized more in this kind of wildfire and religious emotion that seemed to have gone overboard. There would be this dramatic, convicting sermons that would lead large numbers of people to fall over and faint because their conscience was so struck so severely. Sometimes individuals there was this phenomenon known as the jerks, where people would come under conviction of the preaching message, conviction of sin, and they would jerk back and forth. But in spite of these strange phenomena, you had lots of individuals embrace the Christian message, settle down into churches, and you have this significant growth in church life in the West. The third arena, I'll just be real brief on here, is a little bit later in the 1820s. It's associated with the revival ministry of Charles Finney, who began his ministry in the mid-1820s in upstate New York, Oneida, Troy, Utica, these areas. And he became very influential, but vastly controversial as well. To summarize it, he kind of took a lot of these methods in the West that were kind of radical and introduced them in the Northeast. He tamed them down a bit. He repackaged them. They became known as methods for evangelism that he termed new measures of evangelism. And these new measures became very effective in leading folks to embrace the Christian message. Finney was particularly influential in with reaching lawyers like himself. He was trained lawyers, businessmen, people in the middle and upper classes, as well as lower classes. So briefly, I got about a minute left, but I just want to, what were some of the effects of all of these revivals? And I'll just list a couple of them before I hand it on over here. We have the growth of Protestant churches, of evangelical Protestant churches in the United States. Many traditional denominations grew vastly, especially the ones who used the more populist methods of evangelism, like the Methodists and the Baptists. There were new denominations that were founded altogether, the Churches of Christ, the Disciples of Christ. New religions like Mormonism, the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints. You also have, secondly, a surge in kind of evangelicals trying to apply the insights of Scripture and the gospel to certain social issues, social ills. Sometimes it's called the benevolent empire, where there was this lots of folks pooled their resources and time together to address issues of alcoholism, prostitution, dueling, these issues, as well as slavery. And so a lot of the abolitionist movement, some of the early abolitionist movement was generated off of the fumes of Second Great Awakening revivalism. And then my last point of an effect that I'll just mention briefly is the conversion of African Americans. A large number of African Americans converted to Christianity and informed and their own denominations, Baptists and Methodist denominations in this period. Many of the historic Black denominations that are existent today find their roots in this early period of the Second Great Awakening. So, and I'll leave it there.
Professor Caldwell, thank you so much. And then we'll go straight on. Professor Kidd.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. And it's a pleasure to participate in this panel. And I'm really glad that Professor Caldwell said what he said, because that sort of allows me to get into a little bit more of interpretation of the Second Great Awakening with that overview in mind. The Second Great Awakening, as Professor Caldwell has already said, is an amorphous thing, and one of the difficulties with studying it is that people don't know how long it lasted, and we don't know when to say that it stopped. And there's also a lot of debate about what to focus on in the era of the Second Great Awakening. The most likely, of course, is the revivals, and we should do that. But 50 years ago, Donald Matthews, the great distinguished historian of the American South, came out with an article that suggested that we could also view the Second Great Awakening as what he called an organizing process, which is it's sort of a technical, not very exciting sounding term, but I actually think it's an extremely profound way to view what was happening in the Second Great Awakening, which was the conversion of probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans, and then many of those people end up being folded into the life of a congregation, at least marginally, if not centrally involved in a life of a congregation. And that represents, person by person, family by family, a mass organization of the frontier, which was, and rural areas, which was very much up for grabs in terms of social organization in the early republic. Now, having said all that, I deeply believe that many of these people, if not most of them, were also having profound sort of irreducible spiritual experiences in terms of conversion and finding right standing with God. So I absolutely believe that. And I also believe that from the perspective of American history, that part of what's going on here is the organization of a frontier for whites in particular, but to a certain extent for African Americans as well, that was seen as a fearful and alienating place by many people in 1776 and in the early Republic. And there was a widely discussed phenomenon at the time of the possibility that you could have hundreds of thousands, millions of people go out onto the frontier and be dislocated, alienated, without adequate social institutions, and in particular to be unchurched. And that was a pervasive fear. The fear of the unchurched was pervasive among religious observers and people like Timothy Dwight and so forth. And they even had a name for these people. They were the Nothingarians. We today would call them the nuns, Nones. But back then they called them the Nothingarians. These people are going out beyond the reach of individual congregations and pastors. And what is going to happen to these people? Well, you would think that these fears would substantially be true, except for the enormous heroic efforts of thousands of Methodist and Baptist and Congregationalists and Presbyterian and Churches of Christ ministers and on and on and on to evangelize and organize the frontier. So in the early Republic, you have massive population growth, displacement of many Native American groups, followed by the massive growth of population in the Ohio River Valley region, the Trans-Mississippi frontier, the area of the Louisiana Purchase, which happens in 1803 under Thomas Jefferson's administration. And the numbers are just stunning in terms of the millions of people over the decades that are pouring into these regions to find available farmland, or with the advent of the Cotton Kingdom in the 1790s, available land for growing cotton, and those people are usually bringing slaves with them, and so you would really, looking at that pattern, you would not expect necessarily the churches to keep up, but they do. And in some cases, they even, the growth of the churches even outpaces this phenomenal, almost unprecedented population growth pattern in the 1800s in America. The Methodists, especially, and Dr. Wigger, I'm sure, is going to talk more about the Methodists, as he's the real expert on the panel on the Methodists for sure. But as a Baptist, I must admit that the Methodists are the real juggernaut here. The Baptists do well, but the Methodists are just, it's unbelievable. That the statistic I always give my students is that we think that in 1776 that there's about 20 Methodist congregations in America. And by the time of the Civil War, that's over 19,000. So it goes from 20 congregations to more than 19,000. The rate of church growth is absolutely stunning. And so this is the time in American history. I also tell my students, anywhere you go in the South and a lot of the Midwest, if you go to any little bitty town of any size at all, it's going to have First Baptists and First Methodists facing each other, on the central square of the town. And that's the kind of level of organization that I'm talking about. And this in the late 19th century, early 20th century is when that structuring of American towns in the South and Midwest really happens. We could give just countless examples of how this happens. I'll just give one to show that sometimes the growth of the African American church parallels and then sometimes it overlaps with the growth of the white churches. One example of these organizers and preachers and evangelists is Joseph Willis, who was a former slave turned Baptist pastor who may have delivered the first Protestant sermon west of the Mississippi River. It was almost certainly the first Baptist sermon west of the Mississippi River. Willis had received his freedom from slavery in 1787, the same year as the Constitutional Convention. And he subsequently went from South Carolina to the Mississippi Territory and then on into Louisiana. Willis arrives in Louisiana around the time that President Jefferson arranged for the Louisiana Purchase, which Louisiana is only a small part of that. It's basically the middle third of the United States now is the whole Louisiana Purchase. And Willis helped to found the Calvary Baptist Church near Alexandria, Louisiana in 1812, not long after Louisiana achieved statehood, and he had whites and blacks in his congregations. And he's just one of thousands and thousands of pastors like him, most of whose names we don't remember anymore, at least people who aren't experts on this story, who lead to the evangelization and social organization of the American frontier during the long Second Great Awakening. So this kind of growth undergirds the religiosity of American culture and particularly rural and frontier areas that is observed by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, which he's writing and publishing in the 1830s. And, most of you will recall that Tocqueville was struck by the pervasive religiosity that was undergirding American civil society, and that he thought that the churches and voluntary religious societies were the core institutions of American civil society, and that's I'm sympathetic to Tocqueville's view on that, and that process is happening during this period for sure. So Dr. Caldwell has already mentioned a few of the political and social reform implications of the Second Great Awakening, and I think that we want to talk about those a bit more maybe during Q&A. But the political implications certainly include the work of these countless voluntary societies, some of them local, some of them denominational, some of them national and interdenominational, like the American Bible Society, like the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which is the largest missionary organization of the period. And the work of the missionaries even becomes political. At times, the missionary groups are sometimes receiving government funding for their work, especially among Native Americans. They get involved in controversies like the Cherokee removal. And so one of the key missionaries for the ABCFM becomes named in one of the key Cherokee cases, Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester is a New England missionary. Temperance is probably the biggest of the moral reform causes of the time. Abolitionism gets more press, but temperance is a bigger crusade, and especially in the North. Sabbatarianism, trying to have the Sabbath honored in American law, which somewhat humorously focuses all around Sunday mail delivery, which is becoming a thing again, apparently, with Amazon these days. But it doesn't seem to be generating the same kind of Sabbatarian backlash that at least not that I know of. And then most controversially, abolitionism. And so one of the things that you see with abolitionism as an example is that there is a tendency to speak of the evangelicals of the time period as a unified bloc, but they're not unified on some really essential issues, including the morality of chattel slavery. And so you have a very deep divide no surprise, between white evangelicals over the issue of slavery, especially as you start to get into the 1830s and 40s, and you have a more public and aggressive kind of radical abolitionist movement. Many of those people are white and black Northern evangelicals. Not all Northern evangelicals are anti-slavery for sure, but virtually all white Southern evangelicals are pro-slavery. So that is a division among this block of Second Great Awakening evangelicals. And you also have what is in a way a more fundamental division between evangelicals at the time, which is over these voluntary societies, missions organizations, and the political causes like Sabbatarianism. A lot of especially Northeastern evangelicals who also tend to be very well connected in business and politics are the ones who are running and financing these national benevolent organizations. And they do sometimes get some pretty significant pushback from especially certain Baptists who end up becoming the anti-mission or the primitive Baptists, and also some groups who are called the old school Presbyterians. Then Dr. Witter, if he wishes, can tell us more about if those splits are reflected in the Methodist movement, because I do not know. So anyway, I'll conclude by just saying that we shouldn't imagine that the evangelicals, just like today, evangelicals are often represented as a monolith, and they're not. So also in the era of the Second Great Awakening, there are some pretty fundamental splits between different kinds of evangelicals, including about politics and the work of the benevolent organizations.
Thank you. Excuse me. Professor Wigger, if you'd be so kind to give us a third introduction to our discussion.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks to David Randall and Chris Kendall for organizing this. It's always a luxury to go last because you get to listen to your colleagues frame the discussion, and Tommy and Robert have done that brilliantly. So let me try and pick up with something just a little bit different. This was, of course, a period of profound cultural change and also religious change. And one of the things that I think is apparent is that when religious groups chase cultural change, they really don't do very well. The times that religious groups really grow and make a difference is when they're at the leading edge of this, when they're defining cultural change. And I think you see that with a number of the groups that grow dramatically in this period, groups that didn't really exist in colonial America, as my colleagues have said, that they get really big. And kind of the poster child for this is American Methodism. I should say that I'm not a Methodist, never have been, so it's not my tradition. But at the time of the American Revolution, there were just a few hundred Methodists. By the Civil War, a third of all churchgoers were Methodists. By the late 19th century, there were more Methodist churches than post offices in the United States, which is really remarkable. I'll have a little bit more to say about that maybe in a minute. The other thing, though, about religious groups is that, and I don't think this just applies to this period that we're talking about, this kind of so-called Second Great Awakening, but more generally, is that in the American context of a free market religious system, religious groups, churches tend to have a life cycle. So, and a number of these groups that are really influential in this period kind of go through this life cycle. And here's how I think this works. They sort of begin on the margins of society as outsiders, if you will, mostly what we would think of as working class people. They have a tremendous amount of energy, but they don't have much in the way of resources, whether in terms of money or education or social influence. And this certainly applies to the Black churches that grow dramatically in this period. And then what happens is, if they're successful, if they define cultural change, if they sort of define what culture is becoming. And the Methodists do that. They are at the forefront of defining middle-class culture in America during the 19th century. They succeed, so to speak, and they grow, but they also tend to become more affluent. They move more towards mainstream of American society. They move up the sort of social pyramid. And one of the things that happens as you move up this pyramid is that your constituency gets smaller because there are less people at the top as you move up. Methodists certainly do this, although they don't get smaller until actually the 1960s in terms of percentage of related to American population, the broader population. But they do things like they become more concerned with education because now they have the resources to worry about that. So in the middle of the 19th century, Methodists become leaders in building private universities and colleges. So a lot of leading private universities surprisingly have their roots in Methodism. Duke, Vanderbilt, Emory, Northwestern, Boston University, USC, SMU, of course. And then what happens is, as these groups sort of, their constituency changes, other groups come along and backfill where they used to be. So in the case of American Methodism, this is the holiness movement in the late 19th century that kind of breaks off from mainstream Methodism and is more sort of backfills that place that Methodism had left in American society and American culture. And then in the 20th century, also largely from Wesleyan holiness roots, comes Pentecostalism, which, by the 1920s, Methodism is thoroughly middle class, but Pentecostalism is considered that kind of religion on the wrong side of the tracks. But it comes from largely the same theological roots. It isn't so much a change in theology or belief, it's that sort of social location, if you will. By the way, I think the way I look at the Second Great Awakening, it's not so much regional. It's not really so much a frontier thing. I'm not a Marxist historian by any means, but I think class is maybe a little bit better way to look at it. So the Methodist stronghold of this period, their unofficial capital is Baltimore, and the highest density of Methodists are on the eastern shore of Maryland and the Delmarva Peninsula, which is nowhere near the frontier, right? So how does this, what does this cultural adaptation look like? My favorite explanation of this was given by Dorena Lee. Dorena Lee was a Black female Methodist preacher. She was born in 1783 at Cape May, New Jersey. She was born free, but she left her parents at age 7 to become a domestic servant. She only had, by her own account, 6 months of formal schooling. She was converted mostly under the preaching of Joseph Pilmore, who was one of the first preachers that Wesley sent to America. And then she attended Richard Allen's Bethel Church in Philadelphia. Allen, of course, this was an independent Black church within the Methodist Episcopal Church. Allen later split in 1816 from the Methodist Episcopal Church to form the AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first independent Black denomination in the US. But Dorena Lee felt a call to preach while attending Allen's church, and she did so. She had a vibrant preaching career. She was never licensed in either the Methodist Episcopal Church or the AME, but nevertheless, she had this vibrant preaching career. She wrote her autobiography in the 1830s. There's actually another version in the 1840s. But by the time she wrote her autobiography, she knew that a lot of her readers would scoff at all of the dreams and visions and supernatural impressions that she recounts. And right at the end, she acknowledges this and she says, this is the way I understand this. She makes a comparison to the blind. So what she says is, because the blind can't see, they develop a greater sense of touch, a much finer sense of feel than people who have sight have. And she says, because I couldn't see, because I didn't have a formal education, God allowed me to feel. to feel more significantly, to feel more closely the workings of the Holy Spirit. And this is why I have all of these dreams and visions and supernatural impressions that I relate in my autobiography. And I think the question this raises is, can religious groups both see and feel at the same time? And this earlier kind of life cycle that I described, I think what's largely going on here is groups that initially start out feeling because they can't see, because they don't have the resources to see, so to speak, they're able to feel these cultural changes closely. And then as they begin to see, so to speak, they lose that feel, if you will, whether it's voluntarily giving it up or whether it's just a kind of natural process. They tend to do this. And I think you can see this with all kinds of religious groups, Catholics, Mormons, all kinds of religious groups that sort of make this transformation. So I think there are really two things going on here, at least the two things that I've talked about, is that one, you have these groups that figure out new ways to push cultural change forward. And then they naturally go through this kind of life cycle process that gets repeated. It's not unique. I guess my point is it's not unique to the Second Great Awakening. I think a lot of groups do this in the 20th century. I think Pentecostals have sort of worked their way through a similar transformation. But certainly Methodists do that. Robert mentioned camp meetings. This is something they hit on almost accidentally, but they become a phenomenon by, they begin about 1801, and by 1810, Methodists are holding something like 600 camp meetings a year. And if you look at these, it's no accident that most modern political conventions look like a revival meeting. They look like a camp meeting, because politicians in the 19th century, they would go to these Methodist camp meetings that numbered sometimes thousands or tens of thousands of people, and they would look around and say, wow, this really works. This is a great way to grab an audience. And so this is a great example of how a religious group, in this case Methodists, aren't copying other cultural innovations. They're introducing their own. Their preachers look different. You have people like Jarena Lee preaching. That would never have happened in colonial America, at least not to the extent that it does in the first half of the 19th century. And it works. Colonial Americans probably would not have been at all receptive to that, but they are receptive to it in the 19th century. So you have these groups that figure out new ways to be at the cutting edge of cultural change. And in doing so, they make America a more religious place, certainly than the same kind of thing doesn't happen. A good comparison is to Western Europe at the same time. And it's just not going through this same process. It's in fact going the opposite direction. I think that's pretty much my time. So I think I'll stop there and maybe just see what comes up in discussion. So thanks.
And thank you so much. Given that there have been two people interpreting, I almost feel tempted to ask Professor Caldwell, do you have any sort of interpretive stuff you want to give for a few minutes, just to give you sort of like equal time with the others? Just in addition to what you did for your presentation of the basic facts.
I don't have that much else to say. I kind of resonate a lot with what John mentioned about the looking at things through class. This whole issue of seeing and feeling, I think, is very good. How do you capture both of those things together in a religious movement without losing one or the other? That's the old head and heart dichotomy, right? The kind of the life cycle of these movements that he described, I've generally seen a lot of that taking place over the centuries. So yes, but that's all I have. to contribute on that point.
All right, well, I'm going to just toss a question inspired actually by a questioner who mentions Mark Knoll. So as I recollect this, one of Mark Knoll's biggest theses is that, in fact, being in an American republic affects the ideology of American religion in extremely important ways. Whereas I guess I would say that part of what one is usually talking about when one emphasizes the Second Great Awakening is how much this awakening affects America. I don't know if these are quite alternate points of view, but how would you plump down on which is more greatly affected? Is the American Republic more affected by the Great Awakening, or is the Second Great Awakening more conditioned and affected by being in an American Republic? You're free to say that this is an odd question which should not be asked if that's what's going through your minds.
I'll take a swipe at that. I think anything Mark Knoll says is worth seriously considering. But I think he's part of what Knoll is doing is in his project, I think, is expressing warranted concern about how Americanized Christianity became in the era of the Second Great Awakening, and that there was really more, politics that or at least political ideology that was there than should be there, and of course he's writing this in the aftermath of the moral majority, and so there's there's some contemporary concerns there that I share too. I think that it depends a lot on who we're talking about and when. One of the things that you realize in studying either the First or Second Great Awakening is that there can be a difference between the way people talk on special occasions where your sermon is going to get published, and then the way that say a Methodist itinerant is preaching on your average Sunday morning, and I would say that inside the churches, and we do have some evidence to suggest this, that a lot of the message is going to be focused on the sort of spiritual concerns about salvation and lordship and discipleship and those kind of things, and they're not going to be telling people you have to also be a Republican to be an adequate Christian and so forth, small r Republican in that case, so I think that you have definitely some located kind of nature of evangelicalism in the early Republic that I suppose happens in lots and lots of contexts. I'm sure you could find similar patterns in Brazil or Nigeria or China where Christianity is being shaped, at least to some extent, by the local culture and politics. But I'm probably not quite as convinced as Noel is that this is an especially troubling American phenomenon. Versions of it, yes, for sure, but I'm not sure that's all of American evangelicalism.
Well, if neither of you else is leaping to answer that one, I'll go to one from the audience then. John Kuntz asks, can you address the influence of Unitarianism in areas related to the common good, libraries, institutions for the deaf, for the blind, etc., as well as abolitionism and any possible relationship it might have had to the Second Great Awakening? Also, the impact of the Second Great Awakening on the development of higher education in the United States.
Well, I'm not.
Sorry.
Go ahead. I'm not that much of an expert on Unitarianism, other than they weren't as much avid participants in the Second Great Awakening. There was a branch of individuals known as the Universalists, a small movement that was a more revivalized version, say, of, well, they weren't really Unitarian, but they later merged in the 20th century. But yes, of course, the Unitarians were occupying these higher echelons of society, and were generally a northeastern or New England phenomena, and they got into significant debates with a group of New England theologians over the doctrine of the Trinity in the 1820s. But of course, the Unitarians were a significant a movement, a branch of Protestant Christianity that in the 19th century that did help and establish a lot of these institutions, but they weren't as central participants in the Second Great Awakening. Say it to that.
So,
Go ahead.
Oh,
Go ahead, John.
sorry, Tommy.
Sorry.
Not to disparage Unitarians at all
Yeah.
for their achievements, but revolutions rarely start with comfortable elites. It's easy to look at people who have a lot of influence because they end up having a lot of influence and they tell their story very well. But that's not where most revolutionary change happens. And in the 19th century, this change was coming from people like the Baptists and the Methodists and the Mormons and the disciples. Again, these people that start very much on the fringes, so to speak, with a lot of energy, but not with that social capital. It's hard to appreciate sometimes because, as I tried to describe, they give that up along the way. But that's not generally where change starts, so to speak.
You know, one of the controversies that you do get into, I just happen to know it was a massive controversy for the British and Foreign Bible Society, but in these Reformed societies coming out of the Second Great Awakening, you would often have Unitarians who would want to participate. And so that created, in the British and Foreign Bible Society's example, a schism within the society about whether to allow Unitarians to participate in, say, Bible distribution. I happen to be working on a book right now on Thomas Jefferson, and he actually made, as far as I know, one donation to a Bible society in his life, and by that, I think it was around 1813, and by that time he's very clearly a Unitarian, and even somebody like Thomas Jefferson could be persuaded to give a very small donation to a Bible society, partly because he just thought the Bible's, has a really important place in education, and Unitarians were even, would describe themselves as sort of biblicists of a sort. They would just say, we don't happen to find the doctrine of the Trinity in a literal reading of Scripture. So they are, concerns about Unitarians who the Unitarian movement is growing quickly at the same time that the Second Great Awakening is happening, but through different channels. So fear of Unitarianism is certainly a major factor. And then, and I just want to comment on the American education part of the question too. The probably better known originally evangelical colleges are happening in the aftermath of the First Great Awakening. Most obviously, Princeton and Brown are products, certainly in Princeton's case, directly of the First Great Awakening. There are many, many more colleges that are being founded as a result of the Second Great Awakening. We could just give countless of examples of Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian colleges that are being founded in the context of the Second Great Awakening. What my employer, Baylor, is a perfectly good example of sort of late stages of the Second Great Awakening, chartered in 1845 by the Republic of Texas. We always are keen to say, but it's growing out of missionary Baptist organizations who are, among other things, concerned about training up groups of pastors for the growing churches in Texas. And you have certain anti-mission Baptists who don't want to have anything to do with these fancy colleges, and they're taking money away from the local churches, but there's enough momentum to start a Baptist college. And what we're really geographically is kind of the far reaches of the extent of the Second Great Awakening, Central Texas. And so that's, you know, I mentioned that because it's my employer, but it's also just a perfect example of the kind of reform educational momentum coming out of the Second Great Awakening. It must lead to the establishment of dozens, if not hundreds, of colleges.
I'm going to go on to another question while somebody's eager to add another answer to that. All right, a question from John V. How did the Great Awakening affect the lives of slaves living in slavery? Any books or links you can provide? And I'm going to say, for books or links, if you put something into chat or Q&A, then our tech people will put that in for people emails afterwards. And I just actually want to add to that question, you know, not just how did the Great Awakening affect the lives of slaves living in slavery, but how did the lives of slaves living in slavery affect the Great Awakening? You ask it both ways.
It's a remarkable story in the sense that if you look at colonial America, almost no slaves become Christians. The percentage of African Americans who are Christian in the colonial period is remarkably low. By the time what we're talking about today has worked its course, the Black church is at the center of, it grows phenomenally and is at the center of African American culture and life. So it's a remarkable transformation. In a lot of ways, it's more remarkable than anything that happens in kind of the white groups that we're talking about. Then the question is why? Why does this happen? And I think it's a lot of these groups, like the Methodists and Baptists, who fundamentally change the way they interact with their audience and provide new avenues of entry to leadership and resources that are open to Black people and allow them to, African Americans, take ownership of these religious movements. So Richard Allen, I mentioned him, he's a great example. Allen becomes a lay Methodist preacher. He's he starts his own church in Philadelphia, and it's embraced by Francis Asbury, who's head of the Methodist Church. You know, through these connections, you're able to have Black churches and religious movements that just weren't possible in colonial America.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, Professor Wigger is right. I mean, in some ways, this is one of the most remarkable stories in all of American religious history, which is the kind of wholesale conversion of the African American population from not being Christian in almost every case. I mean, not even nominally Christian, and those who came from Africa as slaves, if they had any Christian influence, it was usually Catholic and not Protestant, but that was a pretty small number of the, you know, those charter generations coming as slaves. By say 1900, you know, the vast majority of the African American population has become at least nominally Christian, and the majority of those are Protestants. That's a huge transformation, and part of that is this kind of spiritual, social, cultural organization process too, where the Black church becomes the central social and obviously religious institution of the African American community. And there's an enormous literature on this. Albert Raboteau's Slave Religion is probably the classic work on this that gives a great sense for the meaning of Christianity for enslaved converts and so forth. What difference does it make? Well, I mean, it's debated. Some scholars would take more of a Marxist approach to this, of saying that this was a distraction for slaves, but it was certainly potentially feeding into abolitionist sentiment. I mean, I think we can assume that most slaves didn't like being slaves, but they very rarely had a chance to say something about that publicly. Again, a lot of the early African-American anti-slavery spokespeople, even going back to the Revolutionary period, are evangelicals. But it also, I mean, it's terrifying to some of the masters that it seems like most of the major slave rebellions in the United States after the Revolution and also in the Caribbean tend to be associated with evangelical religion. So that makes a lot of the masters nervous about, why are you getting things like, Nat Turner's rebellion, who in Virginia in 1831, Nat Turner is, among other things, a lay Baptist preacher. And so this is of great concern. I saw one person in the comments asked the related question about, wasn't it illegal for slaves to meet? It was often prohibited for them to meet by themselves. There was much more openness for slaves to come if they got their master's permission to go to white pastor churches. But even that, there was some flexibility that waxed and waned about independent Black churches in the South. We think the first enduring Black church came to South Carolina in 1773, the Silver Bluff Church. But even just in the aftermath of the Nat Turner Rebellion in 1831, African American Baptists had an independent church, or at least a quasi-independent church in Richmond that got shut down after the Nat Turner Revolt. So it was. I mean, Jefferson said, "We have the wolf by the ear." And I think for people like Jefferson, evangelical religion wasn't helping the instability of that situation.
Yeah, the progress of African American evangelization, it kind of went through several phases in the first 2 decades of as I understand it, the first 2 decades of the 19th century. You had there was an effort to convert house slaves, urban slaves, artisan slaves. And then after the 1830s and 40s, there was a shift to the plantation missions societies. Often, Baptists were employed in this. And so they were there. And so through these efforts, you had this kind of gradual, but over the course of about a generation, 40-year period, it's this kind of gradual wholesale or embrace of the Christian faith by many slaves. And as Tommy mentioned, there were many plantation owners who forbid it. There were levels of forbidding, but there was also levels of embracing it as well. There were, and then generally these slaves went to how did they attend or worship services? They either attended biracial churches. They were brought with them to white churches, where by their masters, and they would attend churches that way. Sometimes, actually, as I understand it, in many South Baptist churches in South Carolina, they were white churches, but they were majority. The majority of the people attending them were Black slaves, because there were more slaves being brought to these churches than free whites. There was another venue in which they worshipped. You had these kind of secret, what were known as brush arbor meetings, where you had where after the lights went out, folks went to sleep. Black slaves would go off into these woods, these regions in the dark, and light some torches and have a service, a worship service, where there would be a preacher, there would be kind of accountability, there would be singing. And this is where you get a lot of Black spirituals developing. There would be other types of worship activities, and they nourished their spiritual lives in these settings. And these were often outlawed, and they face severe penalties if found out. But these continued on for decades. So.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. I'm sorry. I was going to do another question. Were you about to respond to something more? No.
Go ahead.
A question from Ray Sanchez. Would it be fair to say that the First Great Awakening was centered around Calvinistic doctrine, and the Second Great Awakening was the antithesis? By Calvinistic, I mean essentially holds to tulip in their soteriology, whether Baptist or Presbyterian. Does this doctrinal emphasis, e.g. non-Calvinists believe salvation can be lost, and thus is largely works-oriented, have anything to do with the long-lasting fruit, or lack thereof, of these revivals? And I will just say to the audience, for those of you who don't know the acronym TULIP, the 5 doctrines of total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints.
Well, Professor Caldwell has written a book about the theology of the revivalists. Maybe he ought to say something about this.
No, yeah, I can talk about this. Yeah, no, your question is a good one. I mean, if you, you often have this contrast. It said, First Great Awakening revivalism is Calvinist. Second Great Awakening revivalism is Arminian, or even worse, what's called Pelagianism. This is a works-oriented, human, manufactured religion. And is that a correct articulation of the kind of the history of doctrine between these two awakenings? It's rather simplistic. I mean, I would say. I mean, you have certainly you would have more. Well, in the early 19th century, you had a significant number, but not I wouldn't say a vast majority, but you have a significant number of American Protestants who kind of reject Reformed theology or Calvinism or the TULIP acronym, and so you would, but a large number of these folks they're either Arminian explicitly, or many of them are just practical preachers who are just not they're not delving into the depths of theology and taking a side. You even have some folks who are just trying to pick and choose from both sides, the best of both sides. But even in that, even though that was even though there was, say, a more of an Arminianization on the average, you might want to say, of American theology of salvation, you still had a large number of Calvinists, of either traditional Calvinists or what are known as kind of New England or New Divinity Edwardsian Calvinists, who are calling people to faith in a somewhat traditional Calvinist point of view. So it's yes, it's good to say, it's accurate to say the First Great Awakening, most of the participants were the scions, the descendants of the Puritan tradition, which was largely a Calvinistically oriented theology. In the Second Great Awakening, you still have a large number of that, but you have a lot more, say, Arminian theology, non-Calvinist theology. especially, I'd just leave it at that. In terms of calling into question the legitimacy of the awakening, it's again, you'd have to take it on an individual basis, individual persons. The pastor would have to adjudicate whether or not the individual has the gospel taken root in that individual. I wouldn't go at this kind of macro level and write off the Second Great Awakening as a kind of an illegitimate revival just because there was more, say, there was more non-Calvinism in it. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think obviously what you think about that last question depends on what you think about Calvinism.
Yes.
But for me, when I compare the two, I mean, I think that contrast is substantially a fair one in America between Calvinist and Arminian because of the role of the Wesleyan Methodists. So in America, the Wesleyan Methodists basically have no role in the First Great Awakening. John Wesley comes to America once, very briefly, and it doesn't go well. So that's another story for another time. But there is a significant Arminian presence in the British side, well, the English side of the First Great Awakening, because the Wesleyans are really making a lot of gains during the 1740s in England. But that's just not a presence in the First Great Awakening in America, which is approaching 100% Calvinist. So you get to the Second Great Awakening, and in terms of numbers, the Methodists are the main event, and they are the Wesleyan Methodists are explicitly Arminian. So that's the most noticeable difference. But the majority of Baptists, especially Baptists outside of the new Free Will Baptist denomination, which is explicitly Arminian, are still Calvinist, and that that certainly goes on. The idea that a majority of Baptists in America are at least moderately Calvinist certainly persists on through the Civil War. And then, I mean, we tend to forget that the Congregationalists and Presbyterians had a pretty significant role in the Second Great Awakening, besides Finney, who is a sort of aberrant Presbyterian, and among other things, for shorthand is Arminian. So, there is significant Congregationalist and Presbyterian growth during the era of the Second Great Awakening, which is overwhelmingly Calvinist. So there's still a major Calvinist presence in the Second Great Awakening, but to me, the huge difference is the role of the Methodists, who go from playing no role in the American Awakening in the 1740s to being the leaders of the Awakening movement in the early 1800s. And I mean, that to me is the major change about the role of Arminianism.
If I could just very briefly, I used to think that the Arminianism of Methodism was an important part of their expansion in the early 19th century, first half of the 19th century. I now think it was less of a factor. It's there, it's part of who they are, but I think it's the other ways in which they connected with their audience and that were more significant, so to speak. And I don't mean to say that belief doesn't matter, because I think it matters entirely. People make sacrifices for a reason, but that split between Calvinism and Arminianism, it just doesn't seem that important to me anymore, at least not to the extent that it used to.
Thank you. I'm going to have a question from David Lytle or Little, and I apologize for getting it wrong, whichever way I did. That the panel has been focusing on the Orthodox groups, Methodists, Baptists, But this is simultaneously you have Mormons, utopian communities, the Shakers, the Oneida, the Universalists, the Millerites, and he's putting it, I can understand how we can separate these groups theologically, but as historians, why should we deal with these phenomena separately? And I guess I just push this, are you dealing with it separately? Are you defining the Second Great Awakening as centrally about people of Orthodox Christian, Protestant faith? And I guess, does this get us to, is your primary approach religious or social? I think is something lurking behind this, that if it's social, then you're talking about a sort of a phenomenon, whatever the religion. If it's religious, you then would make just greater theological distinctions.
So I'll just say something briefly and then turn it over to my colleagues. One way to look at this is just the size of these groups and their broader impact. So that's why you look at Methodists and Baptists and Mormons by the middle of the 19th century as well. It doesn't mean that Shaker beliefs aren't significant or interesting, but there were hundreds of Shakers where there are hundreds of thousands of these other groups.
Yeah, I think that the theological issue does become a problem in knowing how to interpret Mormonism in particular, because there, especially when you're teaching these subjects from a confessional angle, there has been a really strong resistance, understandable resistance among many evangelicals to say that Mormonism is a product of the Second Great Awakening. But I do think in a social and even somewhat theological sense that Mormonism is pretty easy to integrate into the story of the Second Great Awakening. And the Shakers too. I mean, the Shakers is even more clear because a whole lot of the early Shakers were sort of coming out of the radical evangelical movement. But then, whatever dissatisfaction with the evangelical movement, and this is the story that Joseph Smith tells about, all the bickering sects and but who can tell which one is the right one? There's, this ferment, especially, we haven't quite mentioned this, but the role of this disestablishment of the state churches in the revolutionary period, for the most part, means that that there's much less certainty about who gets to say what is true and what is aberrant religion. And so there's an enormous flourishing of innovative entrepreneurial religious groups, including the Methodists. As Professor Wigger has said, I mean, that it's their innovative tactics and just simple hard work too, to go out and reach people. And the Mormons, I think, fit into that model, and the Shakers do too. I think the Millerites, and for those of you who don't immediately recognize the Millerites, this is a predecessor to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Whether Miller is a good example of, you have some pretty radical new types of theological systems coming out of the Great Awakening, but is that theologically evangelical? I mean, probably so. There's some very, very specific views on eschatology and the end times that results in this failed prediction of the return of Christ in 1843 and 44. But when you look at groups like the Millerites, it's not always a choice between clearly Orthodox or clearly heterodox groups. I mean, there's some weird, wild groups that are sort of standing in between. But I tend to think they're all part of the same social and in some ways theological movement that's bubbling up in this kind of ferment growth, disestablished situation, and it results in some new versions to me of more orthodox evangelicalism, and then some sectarian to heterodox heretical type of groups from a traditional evangelical perspective.
Yeah, I tend to, I kind of a mixture of what my colleague said. This was a period of religious experimentation. There was no state church guiding anymore or directly breathing over everyone's back. There was an open field. There was there was an anti-creedal, anti-confessional stance of many folks who wanted to just go directly back to the Bible and forget tradition. And I kind of look at this spectrum of groups. As a result, some were more traditionally oriented. Some continued on the ideals of their original founders: Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians. Others wanted to experiment with kind of intentionally being a non-denomination or being an anti-denomination. These restoration churches. Some of these moved even further and thus shade off into this kind of middle ground between heresy and orthodoxy. And so that's how. And then some went even further and became, from a theological point of view, became heretical. And thus, I mean, so I kind of look. I try to weave this story of all these groups into kind of this setting of this religious entrepreneurial experimentation in the early American Republic here. So, and the other thing, the thing that Dr. Wigger mentioned is just the numbers. I mean, a lot, at least in the beginnings of these other groups, you had smaller numbers, whereas there were lots of Baptists, lots of Methodists. Those were the. And that's why I often will gravitate to speaking about the Orthodox groups. So I do try to weave in some of these other groups as well. So yeah.
Thank you all. I forget to unmute myself too. I have a question from Paula Zaller, which I'm going to push again. About the Civil War, as the carnage devastated people, they turned to the prevailing evangelical assurance that heaven was a reachable destination where all could be once again reunited. This was especially meaningful in the South, and that this is part of the Great Awakening. I want to push that. We were talking about, when do you talk about the beginning and end of the Second Great Awakening? Does it, in point of fact, have any sort of real ending before the Civil War? Does the Civil War and the rise of passions associated actually put an end to it in some real sense? Or is there just sort of historians categorize, by antebellum and postbellum and talk about the Civil War as a climacteric? And is this wrongly applied to separate a broader development in which the Civil War is the story of the Civil War is part of the story of a longer 19th century Great Awakening? In 5 seconds or less.
Yeah, that's a tough one because just because of all the issues surrounding the ending of this period of revivals in America. It's I don't have much to say beyond to address that with, but that would be the reason why, just because of the difficulties associated with when does the Second Great Awakening fizzle out? So.
Really briefly, I see more continuity than disruption or an endpoint, so to speak. Certainly for some groups, this sort of represents a kind of moment of peak or change. But for other groups, that take their place, not so much.
Yeah, I think the Second Great Awakening is the epitome of a category that we need something to call it. I mean, we know something happened, and but the name for it has changed over time. It's sort of like World War I wasn't World War I until there was a World War II. I mean, it's that type of historical category, but we've got to have things like that. I mean, people at the time of the American Revolution actually called it the American Revolution. So there can be, categories that they used at the time, but the Second Great Awakening is not one of them. So, I think anything, any endpoint you put on it is going to be at least a bit arbitrary. But, I tend to think of Finney's ministry as sort of the late stages of the formal Second Great Awakening. And there are massive revivals that are happening, especially in the northern cities in 1857 and 58, that people have debated about whether to include that or not in the Second Great Awakening. And in some ways, I'm with Professor Wigram that it's just kind of a new iteration of this expectation of revival, but there are some particular contexts to it about it's very centered on businessmen, and is in the context of the Panic of 1857. So there's some differences about it, but the Protestant theological context of the Civil War is very much set in place by the Second Great Awakening. And that is a kind of good news, bad news situation from my perspective as a Christian is that, there are a lot of people who make sense of the duress and turmoil and loss, suffering, death of the Civil War through the categories of evangelical spirituality. It also certainly undergirds the abolitionist movement, and a lot of the African American enlistees in the Union Army and so forth are animated by at least generically evangelical conviction and so forth. But it also undergirds the pro-slavery side in important ways, and that kind of deep conviction that we know what the Bible says about slavery, and so the other side must be evil or dishonest. There's an evangelical contribution to that dynamic, which obviously led to the cataclysm of the Civil War. So, I mean, you can't understand the American culture in the Civil War without understanding the Second Great Awakening.
Thank you. I am going to say it's now 3:27. I'm therefore going to ask each of you, if you'd be so kind, is just sort of like a minute for either summing up last thoughts you'd wanted to say, so you don't have the spirit of the staircase as the webinar ends. And then I'll just give a final little goodbye to everybody. But I guess in the same order, if you'd be so kind, Professor Caldwell, do you have a minute of summing up?
Yeah, I'll just say I think, studying this period, I believe, just helps us to get studying this phenomena of the Second Great Awakening helps us to understand a significant portion of the roots of, like, say, the current evangelical movement today, if we want to understand and have a decent sense as to who are these evangelicals that are out there in American society. A lot of what we get, a lot of their DNA was kind of imprinted during this period, and I would think was imprinted in this period of the Second Great Awakening. And I would say you have the beginnings in the First Great Awakening of the evangelical movement, but the second, I really think, established the way it operates, the way a lot of evangelical churches, Christians operate in the world. You see much more derived from the Second Great Awakening phenomena than the first. That would be my only comment. So.
I agree, and I mean, I guess I would just want to emphasize that to the extent to which America is a Christian nation and so forth, is a controversial subject. But if it ever was, I mean, it seems like about 1860 is about the right, the high point of sort of overall intensity, pervasiveness of Christian commitment. And then, tragically, that's followed shortly by the Civil War. So, there's ambivalence all over the place about this. But that it is important to realize that the churching of America, as my colleague Rodney Stark once talked about it, is really accomplished more in from 1800 to 1860 than in the colonial past that we tend to view at a popular level as sort of pristinely Christian somehow. But in terms of just the hard work of Christian adherence and evangelism and so forth, a lot of that is happening, in urban areas and established areas, but also the frontier. And it seems to me that you might have expected the frontier to be the place where there was a massive rise of the nuns, because of disestablishment, because of the lack of infrastructure. But one of the reasons that we talk about the Methodists and Baptists so much here is because they kept up with it. It's an extraordinary story, and it applies both to people of European background and African background.
Thank you, Professor Wigger. And I think you're still muted.
Sorry, I did forget that. Thanks. I agree with everything that Robert and Tommy have said. I would just return to the point that religious groups grow and have the deepest impact when they're leading change in culture and not simply chasing it. And I think one of the things that stands out in this period is that you have groups that are pushing and shaping American culture rather than just trying to chase what seems to be already happening. And I guess it's hard to see how that's happening to the same degree today. Maybe my colleagues can point it out, but I don't see that same sort of shaping and pushing culture in the same way that you see in this really dynamic period for religious movements. It doesn't mean that religious movements today are disconnected from culture, but there's a big difference between sort of trying to chase and shape yourself to fit these things versus being out front and really being the groups and the people that are shaping this in advance, so to speak.
Right. Thank you so much. I thank everyone so much. So my thanks to Professors in reverse order this time, Professors Wigger, Kidd, and Caldwell. My thanks to the audience for showing up and listening and asking such delightful, wonderful questions for me to be able to channel and pass on. I'll just repeat, if you have questions that weren't answered and you want to have them forwarded to the professors, send them to me. I'll forward them very happily. I'll also repeat that it has been recorded and it will be on the NAS website within 24 hours for eternity, or at least until our website provider comes after us. And that also we will be following up with future webinars on history, on literature. As I say, the next one in chronological time is just next week, when we are going to be doing Washington Irving on Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. And gosh, what is the one following that one? There will be one following up on that. You'll find out. It's on our web pages. But the point is, we're having a continuing series. It will be going all the way through. And heavens, maybe even when we finish these, we'll have follow-up ones. We have ideas puttering around for yet further webinars we can do. But that's for the future. And again, thank you all so very much. It's been a delight. And have a wonderful day.